You cut my lock, Marlene.
I authorized the removal, Caleb. That Jeep is leaving today.
Then you just made the one mistake my attorney was waiting for.
Marlene Whitaker stood beside my side gate with bolt cutters in her hand and my broken padlock lying in the gravel. Behind that gate sat my father's 1984 forest green Jeep CJ7. The last thing he signed over to me before cancer took his voice. She thought she was removing an eyesore. She was actually touching the one thing on my property I had already protected from every angle. I didn't shout. I didn't run toward her. I just stood on the porch with my coffee cooling in my hand and watched the garage camera blink red above her shoulder. Marlene pulled back the fitted cover, opened the Jeep with a copied key, and brushed my father's Army dog tags away from the mirror like they were trash hanging in her way. That was the only moment my hand tightened around the mug. She smiled at me and said,
You were warned.
I nodded once.
So were you.
6 minutes later, the sheriff would be waiting at the Briar Ridge entrance. If the last thing your father left you was being stolen in front of your eyes, how long could you stay quiet? After Marlene drove away with the Jeep, the driveway felt too clean. That was the strange part. No shouting, no tire smoke, no dramatic scene for the neighbors to record from behind their blinds. Just the empty square of gravel where that Jeep had sat for 11 years, and the gray cover folded crooked over the ground like someone had skinned a memory and left it there. Every morning, I walked past that gate before breakfast. Not because I needed to check on the Jeep. I knew every inch of it. The left front fender still carried the shallow dent from the winter my father slid into a mailbox on Old Mill Road. The driver's seat had a split down the middle that he patched with black tape and refused to replace because, in his words, a working man's truck ought to remember work. The radio only caught 2 stations if the weather was clear, and the glove box stuck unless you lifted the handle just right. But I still walked past it. Some people keep framed photos on a mantle. Some keep wedding rings in a drawer. I kept my father's Jeep behind a cedar gate under a cover, with his dog tags hanging from the mirror and an old country cassette still in the console. The Jeep smelled like oil, dust, sun-baked vinyl, and the peppermint candies he used to keep in the ashtray after he quit smoking. On his bad chemo days, when the house felt too quiet, I would sit in the driver's seat for 10 minutes and put my hand on the cracked steering wheel. I never started the engine then. I just sat there and let the smell bring him back without asking too much from it. I drove it twice a year, once on his birthday, once on Veterans Day. Same road, same route, past the little white church where he parked it every Sunday, past the ball field where he used to lean against the hood and wave me home from third base, then back through Briar Ridge before lunch. I never made a show of it. I never put flags on it. I never asked anyone to understand. Maybe that is where people like Marlene get dangerous. They look at quiet care and mistake it for weakness. They look at an old vehicle and see only paint, rust, and resale value. They do not see a man folding his uniform for the last time. They do not see a father pretending not to be tired while teaching his son how to shift into second. They do not hear the sentence he said when he handed me the signed title with fingers already too thin. Don't let anyone treat it like junk. That was not a legal instruction. It was a trust. And what is a thing worth when the person who gave it to you is gone, but the promise attached to it is still alive? That morning, standing in the empty driveway, I looked at the broken padlock in my palm. It was colder than it should have been. Then I picked up the cover, folded it properly, and placed it on the workbench. Marlene had taken the Jeep. She had not taken what my father meant by it. I did not call Marlene first. That would have given her exactly what she wanted. A conversation she could twist into a dispute between neighbors. I did not call the HOA office either. That office had stopped being an office months ago. It had become Marlene's personal letterhead with a receptionist. Instead, I walked back inside, set the broken padlock on the kitchen table, and opened the folder my attorney had told me to keep near the phone. Renee Caldwell was not dramatic. She did not use big speeches. She handled property disputes the way my father used to handle engines, slowly, cleanly, and with no wasted movement. 2 weeks earlier, when Marlene had stood in my driveway and threatened to handle the Jeep herself, Renee had watched the video twice and said, "Let her touch it." I remember looking at her across the conference table. "She's not going to stop." "No," Renee said. "But the difference between a threat and a crime is action." That sentence had stayed with me. It was why I had not raised my voice when Marlene cut the lock. It was why I had not stepped in front of the Jeep. A younger man might have. A more emotional man might have grabbed the gate and turned one bad decision into 2. But my father had taught me better than that. He was not soft. Nobody who came home from Vietnam and spent 30 years repairing county roads in Tennessee was soft. But he believed anger was a tool with no handle. Pick it up wrong, and it cut you first. So I stood still. Not because I was afraid of Marlene. Because I had made a promise, and promises are not protected by tantrums. They are protected by patience, paper, cameras, and knowing the exact moment to let the other person prove who they are. The original deed was in that folder. So was the vehicle title. So were photographs showing the Jeep hidden behind the gate, invisible from the street. So were copies of every fine Marlene had sent, every response I had mailed back, and every certified receipt showing she had received them. She knew the Jeep was not abandoned. She knew it was registered. She knew it was on private property. She knew it belonged to me. That made what she did something much cleaner than a misunderstanding. It made it a choice, and maybe that is where dignity really starts. Not in how loudly you defend what matters, but in how carefully you refuse to let someone else define it for you. I picked up my phone and called Renee. When she answered, I said only one sentence. She took the Jeep. There was a pause. Then I heard papers move on her desk. Did you get video? All of it. Good, she said. Now call the sheriff. The sheriff's dispatcher asked me the same question twice. Sir, are you saying the vehicle is being stolen right now? Yes, Mom, I said. From inside my locked gate. And the person taking it is known to you? Yes. Marlene Whitaker, president of the Briar Ridge HOA. There was a silence on the line. The kind people use when they are trying to decide whether a story is strange or serious. I did not blame her. HOA disputes usually came wrapped in barking dogs, mailbox colors, and hedges trimmed 2 inches too tall. Not grand theft on a Saturday morning. But I had a live camera feed, a cut lock, a title in my name, and a green Jeep rolling away from my property with a woman behind the wheel who had no right to touch it. The dispatcher's voice changed when I told her about the copied key. Copied key? Yes, Mom. I never gave her one. That was the first practical fear that hit harder than the emotional one. If Marlene had a key to the Jeep, what else did she have? Who else had she done this to? How many locked gates in Briar Ridge were not really locked anymore? The Jeep was not expensive in the way new vehicles are expensive. It would not impress anyone at an auction, but losing it would have broken something no insurance policy could replace. The dog tags could be thrown away. The cassette could disappear. The dent on the bumper, the worn gear shift, the little silver cross my father tucked behind the visor after my mother died, all of it could vanish. In an impound yard, a scrap lot, or the back of some developer's storage shed before noon. That was Marlene's pressure. She had spent 3 months trying to make me choose between peace and memory, pay the fines or keep fighting, remove the Jeep or become a problem, give up the thing that mattered, or let her make daily life smaller and uglier. For a moment, I understood why some people surrendered, not because they were wrong. Because being right can be exhausting when the person hurting you controls the envelopes, the meetings, and the tone of every public conversation. But if I let her take that Jeep, what would I really be teaching her? That grief has no property line, that a promise becomes negotiable when a board president dislikes the view. I gave the dispatcher the GPS location moving toward the main entrance. Then I walked back to the porch and watched the empty gate until the first siren cut through the morning. The first sign that Marlene had been planning this came 3 months before she cut the lock. It arrived in a white envelope with the Briar Ridge seal pressed crooked at the top. Notice of non-conforming vehicle storage. That was the phrase she used. Not abandoned, not yet, just non-conforming. Like my father's Jeep had somehow become a problem by existing quietly behind a gate nobody could see through. I read the letter at the kitchen table with the morning light coming across the floor. Marlene claimed the Jeep violated new community visual standards because recreational vehicles, antique vehicles, and inoperable objects could not be stored on residential lots. I remember stopping at that word, objects. My father had driven that Jeep to work with a thermos of coffee between the seats. He had carried lumber in the back when he rebuilt our porch. He had taught me to check tire pressure with my thumb before I trusted any gauge. But to Marlene, it was an object. I sent back the registration, current insurance, photographs from the street showing the Jeep was not visible, and a copy of the original Briar Ridge covenants. The covenants allowed enclosed side yard storage as long as it was screened from public view. A week later, she sent a fine, $200, then $500, then a warning that continued refusal could result in association-directed removal. That was when I went to her office. Marlene sat behind a glass desk in a room that smelled like lemon polish and new money. She wore the same cream windbreaker. She wore the morning she stole the Jeep, with the HOA logo stitched over her heart like a badge from a government agency. I placed my folder on her desk. "The rule you're citing isn't in the covenants," I said. She did not open the folder. "Briar Ridge has changed," she said. "People move here for a certain standard. My Jeep is behind a locked gate. It's still not the image this community wants. It was my father's." That finally made her look up, but not with sympathy, with impatience. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "everyone has old family things. At some point, adults learn what to keep and what to clear out." I looked at her for a long second. That was the first time I understood she was not confused. She simply believed memory was clutter when it belonged to someone else. And what kind of person has to become so polished on the outside that they can look at the last piece of a dead man's life and see only a violation? I had two choices after that meeting. I could make the Jeep disappear, pay Marlene's fines, and buy myself peace. There was a storage facility 12 miles outside town with a locked bay and a monthly fee I could afford. Renee even told me that moving it temporarily might make the pressure stop. But pressure stopping is not the same as a wrong thing becoming right. So I left the Jeep where it was. Not out front, not on the street, not under a tarp beside the mailbox like Marlene kept implying in her letters. It stayed behind the cedar gate my father and I built the summer after my mother died, when neither of us knew how to talk about loss. So we spent 3 weekends measuring posts, mixing concrete, and pretending the work was only about privacy. That gate had been there longer than Marlene had lived in Briar Ridge. The Jeep had been hidden behind it long before she learned to say community, standards with that little practiced smile. I tightened the hinges. I replaced the old hasp. I added a second camera over the garage and a small GPS tracker under the rear frame, the kind I used to install on county equipment when contractors kept misplacing trailers. Then I waited. That was harder than it sounds. Every envelope from the HOA felt like someone tapping a finger against a bruise. Every board meeting notice carried the same threat dressed in cleaner language. Marlene wanted me to react in public. She wanted me angry, loud, old-fashioned, unreasonable. She wanted the neighbors to see a stubborn man defending an old Jeep instead of a board president inventing authority she did not have. So I gave her nothing she could use. I answered every notice by certified mail. I kept every receipt. I saved every voicemail. I wrote down dates, times, names, and exact words. When she sent a contractor to photograph the side gate, I photographed him photographing it. When she left a final notice taped to my mailbox, I kept the tape. And when Mrs. Alvarez from 2 houses down stopped me at the curb and whispered that Marlene had pressured her about her late husband's tool shed too, I finally understood the Jeep was not the whole story. It was the door Marlene chose to open. How many people give up something meaningful, not because they want to, but because one person with a title makes the fight feel too expensive? I decided then that I was not just protecting my father's Jeep. I was going to let Marlene show everyone exactly what she was willing to do to take. Marlene did not move quickly at first. That was part of her method. She liked making people feel the walls closing in 1 inch at a time. A fine here, a certified notice there, a comment at the mailbox, a line in the meeting minutes about non-compliant legacy clutter without using anyone's name. Everyone knew whose Jeep she meant. At the next HOA meeting, I sat in the back row and watched her perform concern for the room. She talked about property values, buyer expectations, neighborhood cohesion, and the danger of allowing sentimental exceptions to undermine standards. Sentimental exceptions. I wrote the phrase down. My father had used that Jeep to pull Mrs. Alvarez's car out of a ditch during the ice storm of 1998. He had hauled sandbags in it when the creek flooded. He had driven it slowly behind the Memorial Day color guard because one of the older veterans could no longer walk the whole parade route. But in Marlene's mouth, all of that became sentiment, a weakness, something embarrassing. She never looked at me when she spoke. That bothered me less than it should have. People who know they are right usually do not need to avoid the person they are accusing. After the meeting, a younger board member named Patrick caught me near the exit. "Caleb," he said quietly, "you might want to just move it for now." "For now?" He glanced toward the conference room, where Marlene was laughing with 2 real estate agents beside the coffee urn. "She's not letting this go." I looked through the glass wall at her polished smile, her perfect posture, her little circle of people nodding like she had invented common sense. "No," I said. "I don't believe she is." That night, I walked out to the Jeep and lifted the cover just enough to see the dog tags hanging in the dark. They swung once in the porch light. I did not touch them. Some things you do not touch unless your hands are steady. Renee filed the first letter the following Monday. It was not a lawsuit. Not yet. It was a clean, narrow warning addressed to the Briar Ridge Board, with Marlene copied by name. Renee did not accuse, she documented. She attached the original covenant language, the vehicle title, current registration, insurance, photographs from the street, and a plain statement that any attempt to enter my property or remove the Jeep would be treated as trespass and theft. Marlene answered with a 2-sentence email. The association will continue enforcement according to board policy. Mr. Rourke is not exempt from community standards. Renee printed that email and slid it into the folder. Good, she said. That was how I learned to recognize useful arrogance. I also drove to the county clerk's office and pulled the older Briar Ridge filings myself. I wanted my hands on the paper. There is something different about reading a rule on a screen and seeing the original pages stamped, indexed, and recorded before half the houses here existed. The vehicle restriction Marlene kept citing was not there. What I did find was stranger. Any new restriction affecting private storage, vehicle ownership, or screened side yard use required approval from 2/3 of all homeowners, not just the board. Marlene's new rule had passed in a Thursday meeting with 5 board members and no membership vote. Renee had already suspected that, but the next file mattered more. It was a complaint from an older widower named Thomas Bell, withdrawn 6 months earlier. He had claimed the HOA pressured him to sign a landscaping easement along his back fence after threatening fines over his late wife's greenhouse. The complaint disappeared after a private settlement. Then Mrs. Alvarez gave me copies of her letters. Then Patrick, the younger board member, called Renee from a parking lot and admitted Marlene had been discussing problem properties with a developer before. Violations were even issued. Piece by piece, the Jeep became part of a larger map. Not legally, not yet, but morally it was clear. Marlene was not enforcing standards. She was finding old people, quiet people, grieving people, people attached to things that did not look polished enough for her plans. And what do you call it when someone studies what people love most, then uses rules to make them surrender it? I kept the Jeep covered. I kept the cameras running. I kept my voice even. Then, 2 weeks before the theft, Marlene walked up my driveway and made the threat Renee had been waiting for. 2 weeks before Marlene cut my lock, she came without an envelope. That was how I knew something had changed. She walked up the driveway at 6:40 in the evening, when the sun was low enough to turn the Jeep's cover silver through the slats of the gate. I was in the garage, cleaning a socket wrench my father had marked with red tape so it would stop disappearing into other people's toolboxes. Marlene did not say hello. This has gone far enough, she said. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped outside. She held a clipboard against her chest, not because she needed it, but because people like Marlene always carried something official-looking when they planned to say something unlawful. The board has authorized corrective action. What action? Removal. I looked past her toward the street. No tow truck yet, no contractor. Just her white SUV at the curb and 2 neighbors pretending not to watch from across the road. You don't have authority to remove anything from behind my gate, I said. Her smile tightened. That gate is exactly the problem. You've created a concealed storage area for a prohibited object. There was that word again. Object. I felt the old anger move once under my ribs, then settle. My father's Jeep's titled, registered, insured, screened from view, and parked on my property, and it is still dragging this community backward. The sentence landed harder than I expected. Not because it was clever, because she said it with the calm certainty of someone who had never once considered that old things might be holding people together. I saw my father's dog tags through the windshield, catching one thin line of sunset beneath the cover. Marlene leaned closer. If you won't remove it voluntarily, the association will handle it. I looked at the camera over the garage. Then I looked back at her. Say that again. She did, clearer the second time, and this time I let the camera keep the promise for me. Marlene saved her worst words for the following board meeting. By then, the dispute had become public enough that people showed up early. Folding chairs filled the clubhouse room. Someone brought a stack of printed bylaws. Someone else whispered that the sheriff's office had been asking questions. Marlene stood at the front beside the Briar Ridge flag, dressed like a woman preparing for a ribbon cutting, not a fight over a dead man's Jeep. I sat in the second row with Renee beside me. Marlene opened with property values, then safety, then aesthetics, then, finally, me, Mr. Rourke has chosen personal sentiment over community responsibility, she said. This board cannot allow one resident's attachment to junk to dictate the standards of an entire neighborhood. Renee's pen stopped moving. I kept my hands folded. Marlene looked directly at me then, as if she had been waiting to say it where everyone could hear. His father may have loved that vehicle, she said, but grief does not give anyone the right to store a relic behind a fence forever. The room went still in a way even Marlene noticed. There are insults that make you angry because they are loud, and there are insults that make you calm because they show you exactly what kind of person is standing in front of you. I did not answer her. I thought of my father sitting in that Jeep outside the oncology clinic, pretending the appointment had gone better than it had. I thought of his hand resting on the gear shift, because holding something solid helped him hide the tremor. I thought of him signing the title across our kitchen table, then sliding it toward me like it weighed more than paper. Marlene saw a relic. I saw the last place where my father's hand still had a shape. She kept talking. She said the Jeep encouraged neglect. She said exceptions created disorder. She said residents who refused to modernize were forcing the association to take necessary action. Then she made her second mistake. She held up a printed notice labeled Authorization for Association Removal and announced that it would be executed within 14 days if I did not comply. Renee leaned close without looking at me. Let her finish, so I did. Because sometimes the most important thing you can say in a room full of people is nothing at all. If someone can look at another person's grief and call it clutter, what else are they willing to erase when nobody stops them? The sheriff's office did not arrive at the clubhouse that night. That was not how Renee wanted it handled. If we turn this into a shouting match in front of the board, she told me afterward, Marlene becomes a victim of harassment. If we let her make the next move, she becomes evidence. So the system entered quietly. First, Renee sent a preservation letter to the HOA's management company, demanding that all emails, meeting notes, enforcement records, and communications with outside vendors be retained. Then she sent a copy to the HOA's insurance carrier. That got attention faster than any angry speech would have. 2 days later, Deputy Harlan from the county sheriff's office came to my house. He was broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, and careful with his questions. He stood by the side gate, looked at the cut marks Marlene's contractor had left from an earlier inspection, and asked me to walk him through the timeline. I showed him everything, the letters, the fines, the certified receipts, the video of Marlene saying the association would handle removal, the photographs proving the Jeep could not be seen from the street, the title with my name on it. When I opened the gate and lifted the cover, he did not say anything for a moment. The dog tags swung lightly from the mirror. Deputy Harlan reached out, then stopped before touching them. "Your father served?" he asked. "Vietnam," I said. He nodded once. "My uncle, too." That was all he said, but it changed the air around the Jeep. Not legally. Legally, it was still a vehicle titled to me and parked on my property. But for the first time since Marlene started this, someone outside my family looked at it and did not see junk. He saw enough to be careful. The next day, Renee learned that Marlene had contacted a towing company outside the county, not the local one Briar Ridge usually used, a private operator with no standing contract and no written authorization beyond Marlene's letterhead. That mattered. A real enforcement action leaves a paper trail, board authority, proper notice, legal basis, vendor agreement, access permission. Marlene had pieces of paper, but not the kind that gave her power. She had decorations that looked official from a distance. Then Patrick called again. This time, he said the board had never voted on a specific removal. Marlene had told them the attorney had approved it. The attorney had told Renee he had approved no such thing. By Friday, Renee had filed a request for emergency injunctive relief. By Saturday morning, Marlene decided not to wait for a judge. She brought bolt cutters instead, and when a person chooses metal teeth over lawful process, they are not enforcing rules anymore. They are showing everyone what they believed their title allowed them to become. An older man named Wallace Pike gave Renee the missing piece. Wallace had lived in Briar Ridge since the first road was still gravel. He was 82. Walked with a cane, and still wore pressed shirts to the mailbox, like the world deserved a little effort. I knew him mostly as the man who waved from his porch and kept a bird feeder shaped like a church. He called me Sunday afternoon, one day after Marlene took the Jeep. I should have said something sooner, he told me. I heard shame in his voice before I knew what he meant. Wallace had served on the original architectural committee, back when Briar Ridge was not trying to look like a luxury brochure. He remembered my father bringing that Jeep into the neighborhood. He remembered the board discussing side yard storage because half the original residents had boats, work trailers, old tractors, or trucks they used for more than grocery runs. That rule was written to protect people like your father, Wallace said, not to punish them. Then he told Renee about a binder. It had been kept in the clubhouse storage room for decades. Original minutes, early committee notes, and handwritten explanations of why certain covenant language had been added. Marlene's board had stopped using it years ago. Wallace believed it was still there, buried behind holiday decorations and old pool signs. Renee requested it formally that same evening. By Monday morning, Patrick sent her photographs from inside the storage room. There it was, a blue binder labeled Founding Documents, 1987. One page changed everything. The note beside the side yard storage clause said residents were allowed to keep screened vehicles and equipment because several founding families owned work and service vehicles of personal or family significance. My father's name was not on that page. It did not need to be. The rule Marlene used against him had been built to protect him. How many truths sit quietly in old paper while loud people rewrite history from a podium? Wallace apologized again before hanging up. I told him the truth. You spoke before it was too late, and for the first time since the gate swung open, the empty space beside my garage felt less like a loss and more like a trap Marlene had already stepped into. The emergency hearing was set for Monday at 2. That gave Marlene 48 hours to do what she thought was clever. She did not store the Jeep at a licensed impound lot. She did not file a police report. She did not notify me where it had been taken. Instead, she had it moved behind her husband's warehouse on the east side of town, a place owned by a development company that had been trying to buy out 3 older lots along Briar Ridge's south boundary. Renee found that out before lunch. The GPS tracker gave us the location. The sheriff's office confirmed the address. Then Deputy Harlan called me with a voice that sounded too controlled to be casual. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "we located the vehicle. Is it damaged?" "Not visibly." I let out a breath I did not know I had been holding. Then he added, "But there are people there discussing transport." "Transport where?" He paused. "Out of county." That was the closest I came to losing my temper. Not because I was surprised. By then, Marlene had already shown me who she was. But hearing that she might send my father's Jeep somewhere I could not reach before a judge even heard the case made the kitchen tilt slightly around me. The dog tags could vanish in a box. The cassette could be tossed into a dumpster. The Jeep could become inventory, scrap, leverage, anything except what it was. A vehicle can be replaced. A title can be reissued. Metal can be repainted. But who gives back the exact place where your father's hand rested when he taught you to drive? Renee told me not to go there. "Caleb, listen to me," she said. "If you show up angry, she wins one piece of this. Let the sheriff do his job." So I stayed home. That was the worst hour of the whole thing. I stood in the garage with the empty cover folded on the workbench. The wrench with the red tape lay beside it. The broken padlock sat in a clear evidence bag. Everything that belonged to the Jeep was still there except the Jeep itself. For the first time, the promise I made my father felt fragile, not broken, but close enough that I could hear the crack starting. The big document did not arrive as a dramatic discovery. It came as a photograph on Renee's phone, slightly crooked, taken by Patrick in the clubhouse storage room while Marlene was still telling people the board had everything under control. Renee enlarged the image and turned the screen towards me. It was the 1987 founding binder, open to the covenant notes on screen storage. There, in blue ink faded almost gray, was a paragraph written by the first board secretary. It explained why Briar Ridge allowed side yard storage behind gates. Several original residents owned service vehicles, farm equipment, military vehicles, and family-use trucks that were not decorative, but personally necessary, and historically tied to the households maintaining them. Renee tapped the last line. "No future board shall restrict such screened storage without a 2/3 vote of the full membership." That was the first mended thread. The second came from my father's file cabinet. I had avoided that cabinet for years because the top drawer still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and carbon paper. My father kept every receipt he ever thought might matter. Tires, batteries, registration renewals, insurance cards, oil filters. Even the handwritten bill of sale from the man who sold him the Jeep after he came home from Vietnam. Behind the registration folder was an envelope I had forgotten. Caleb Jeep, my name in his blocky handwriting. Inside was a copy of the title transfer, a note from his oncologist confirming he was still competent when he signed it, and one short letter written on yellow legal paper, "Son." This Jeep carried me back into ordinary life when I did not know how to come back myself. It took me to work, to your games, to your mother's grave, and to every appointment I was too proud to admit scared me. I am giving it to you because you understand that some things are not valuable because they are expensive. They are valuable because they stayed. Do not let anyone treat it like junk. Dad, I read it once. Then I folded it back exactly along the old creases. Renee was quiet for a long time. That letter is not what wins the legal case, she said finally. I know, but it explains why the case matters. The third piece came from the sheriff's office Monday morning. Investigators had obtained Marlene's communications with the towing operator and her husband's development company. One email used the phrase Rourke Jeep Removal as if it were a project name. Another referred to my property as one of the legacy holdouts. Legacy holdouts, that was what we were to them. Not neighbors, not people, not families with histories rooted under the pavement. Obstacles. And when people start calling memory an obstacle, how long before they convince themselves they have the right to bulldoze it? By noon, Renee had everything in order. The original covenant notes, the invalid board vote, the video threat, the theft footage, the GPS record, the warehouse location, Patrick's statement, Wallace's binder, and my father's letter. Marlene thought the hearing would be about an old Jeep. She was about to learn. It was about the kind of power that believes old things stop belonging to people just because someone richer wants the view cleaned up. For almost 20 minutes, Marlene looked like she had won. That is what I remember most about the courthouse hallway. She stood near the windows with her husband, 2 board members, and a lawyer who kept checking his phone like he had somewhere cleaner to be. She wore a navy dress instead of the HOA windbreaker, but the expression was the same. Polished, certain, faintly annoyed that anyone had forced her to explain herself. The Jeep was still behind the warehouse. That fact sat in my chest heavier than the folder in my hands. I knew Renee had evidence. I knew the sheriff had acted fast. I knew Patrick had finally told the truth and Wallace had given us the old binder. But knowing those things did not change the empty space beside my garage. It did not change the image of Marlene brushing my father's dog tags aside like loose string. Sometimes people think patience means you do not feel the damage. That is not true. Patience means you feel all of it and still choose not to hand your pain to the wrong person. Marlene walked past me before the hearing room opened. She stopped just close enough that only I could hear her. You should have moved it when I gave you the chance, she said. I looked at her. For a second, I saw the whole thing the way she wanted me to see it. An old man defending an old Jeep, a dead father reduced to an emotional excuse, a neighborhood board pretending theft was procedure. She had taken the vehicle. She had hidden it. She had forced me into court to ask permission to keep what had already belonged to me. That was her false victory, and I hated how real it felt. Then her husband's phone buzzed. He read the screen, leaned toward her, and whispered something that made her smile disappear. I did not know it yet, but deputies had just reached the warehouse. They had found the Jeep parked behind a chain-link fence with a transport trailer backed up in front of. The tow operator had no impound authorization, no court order, and no signed consent from me. What he did have was a folder Marlene had given him. Inside were photographs of my gate, a removal notice, a copied key tag, and one printed page labeled Rourke Jeep Removal Plan. When Renee received the update, she did not smile. She only placed her hand on my folder and said, "Do not react in there." I nodded. But under the folder, my fingers were pressed flat against my father's letter. For one awful moment, I had believed I might lose the thing I had promised him I would protect. And maybe that is the cruelest kind of power, not the kind that takes everything at once, but the kind that makes you stand quietly and watch someone treat your last connection to family like paperwork. That night, after the hearing was paused for the sheriff's update, Renee drove me home to get one more document. The house was quiet when I opened the door. Too quiet. For years, quiet had been something I understood. My father had lived quietly after the war. My mother had grieved quietly when the doctors stopped offering new words. I had learned from both of them that pain did not need an audience to be real. But that night, the quiet had a hollow center. I went into the garage and stood beside the empty space where the Jeep belonged. The fitted cover was still folded on the workbench. The wrench with red tape lay beside it. Above the bench, on a nail my father had hammered in crooked, hung his old canvas jacket. I had not worn it since the funeral. I reached into the pocket and felt something small and hard. A peppermint candy, still wrapped, still twisted closed at both ends. For a second, I was 8 years old again. sitting in the passenger seat while my father drove me home from Little League practice. I had struck out 3 times that day and refused to talk. He did not lecture me. He just reached into the ashtray, handed me a peppermint, and said, "Some days, son, you just get back in the Jeep." That was how he loved people. Not with speeches, with rides home, with fixed hinges, with a thermos of coffee left on the porch, with a vehicle that started even in January, because he believed a man ought to maintain what carried him. I sat on the workbench and held that old candy in my palm until the wrapper crackled. The Jeep had never been about metal. It was the place where my father's steadiness still had a shape. It was the smell of oil on his cuffs, the sound of his boots on the running board, the way he tapped the steering wheel twice before backing out of the driveway. Marlene could not know all that, but she did not have to know all that to know she had no right to touch it. How much of a family can live inside one ordinary object before the rest of the world is required to treat it with care? I put the peppermint back in the jacket pocket. Then I took my father's letter, placed it in a clean folder, and drove back to court with my hand steady on the wheel. The judge did not ask Marlene how she felt about the Jeep. That was the first thing that seemed to unsettle her. She had built her whole defense around tone, community standards, visual harmony, resident expectations, responsible governance. She spoke like a woman trying to make theft sound like housekeeping. But Judge Ellison kept bringing her back to paper. "Show me the membership vote," he said. Marlene's attorney opened a binder, turned 3 pages, and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the board approved the updated vehicle standard in executive session." That was not my question. The room went quiet. Renee stood with the original covenants in front of her, the 1987 founding binder beside them, and the video paused on the courtroom screen behind us. Marlene was frozen there in full color, bolt cutters in her hand, my side gate open, my father's Jeep visible behind her. Judge Ellison looked at the screen, then back at Marlene's attorney. "The covenants require 2/3 approval of all homeowners for this category of restriction. Do you have that vote?" "No, Your Honor." "Do you have a court order authorizing entry onto Mr. Rourke's property?" "No, Your Honor." "Do you have written consent from the vehicle owner?" "No." "Do you have statutory authority allowing a homeowners association president to cut a private lock, enter a screened side yard, use a copied key, and remove a titled vehicle from private property?" No one answered. The silence did more damage than shouting ever could. Then Renee played the video from my garage camera. The room watched Marlene walk up my driveway with bolt cutters. They watched her cut the padlock. They watched her fold back the Jeep's cover. They watched her open the door with a copied key. They watched her brush my father's dog tags away from the mirror. I did not look at Marlene during that part. I looked at the judge. His face did not change much, but his pen stopped moving when the tags swung. Renee did not make a speech about grief. She did not need to. She simply placed my father's letter into evidence as part of the ownership file and said, "This explains why my client took extraordinary care to preserve the vehicle, and why the association had repeated notice that it was not abandoned, not inoperable, and not theirs." Then she showed the email labeled Rourke Jeep Removal, then the invalid board minutes, then Patrick's sworn statement that no specific removal vote had occurred. Then the tow operator's statement that Marlene personally handed him the copied key. Then the sheriff's photographs of the Jeep behind the warehouse, blocked by a transport trailer. By the time Renee finished, Marlene's attorney looked smaller in his suit. Judge Ellison turned to Marlene. "Mrs. Whitaker, did you direct the removal of Mr. Rourke's vehicle?" Marlene lifted her chin. "I directed enforcement of community standards." "That is not what I asked." Her mouth tightened. "Yes. Did you know the vehicle was titled to him?" "Yes." "But did you know it was behind a locked gate on his property?" "Yes." "Did you know there was a pending request for emergency relief before this court?" Her attorney touched her arm, but too late. I knew he was trying to delay enforcement. The judge leaned back. "No, Mrs. Whitaker. He was trying to use the legal process. You were the one who chose not to wait for it." That was the moment the room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but everyone felt it. The board members stopped looking at Marlene. The homeowners in the back row stopped whispering. Deputy Harlan, standing near the door, folded his hands in front of him like he already knew what came next. Judge Ellison ordered the immediate return of the Jeep under sheriff's supervision. He declared Marlene's vehicle rule unenforceable because it had never received the required membership approval. He froze all fines connected to that rule. He ordered the HOA to preserve records connected to every similar enforcement action for the past 3 years. Then he looked over his glasses, and based on the evidence presented today, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for review of potential criminal conduct. Marlene turned pale. Her husband stood halfway, then sat back down when Deputy Harlan looked at him. The judge was not finished. This court sees many neighborhood disputes, he said. Most involve misunderstandings, poor communication, or competing interpretations of rules. This is different. This was a private citizen's property, behind a private lock, removed without lawful authority while judicial review was pending. Renee touched my sleeve, a small warning to stay still. I did. But when the judge asked whether I wanted to address the court before the temporary order was entered, I stood. I had not planned to speak. For a second, I saw my father's handwriting on that yellow paper. I saw the peppermint wrapper in his jacket pocket. I saw Marlene's hand pushing the dog tags aside. I looked at the judge first, then at Marlene. You kept calling it junk, I said. My father called it the thing that brought him home. That is the difference between ownership and possession. No one interrupted. I sat down. That was all. Sometimes the strongest sentence is the one you do not decorate. Outside the courtroom, Deputy Harlan told me the Jeep was already being loaded onto a sheriff-approved flatbed, not the one Marlene hired. He said the digs were still there. The cassette was still in the console. The little silver cross was still tucked behind the visor. I nodded because speaking would have made the moment too large. Marlene walked past us with her attorney, but this time there was no polished smile, no little performance of authority, no careful language about standards, just a woman who had mistaken a title for power, a board vote for law, and an old Jeep for something no one would defend. And maybe real justice is not only when the law says you were right. Maybe it is when a room full of people finally sees the thing someone tried to erase and understands why it mattered. 3 hours after the order, the Jeep came home on a flatbed. Deputy Harlan followed it into my driveway, and for a moment nobody moved. The afternoon sun sat low behind the trees, turning the windshield gold. The forest green paint looked dusty but whole. The cover was folded on the passenger seat. The dog tag still hung from the mirror, swinging lightly as the flatbed settled. I walked up slowly. Not because I was afraid of what I would find, because some returns deserve to be approached with care. The driver lowered the ramps. The Jeep rolled down with that familiar, old creak in the suspension, the same sound it made when my father eased it over a gravel road after church. I opened the door, and the smell came out first, oil, vinyl, dust, and the faint sweetness of peppermint that had lived in that ashtray for 30 years. I put one hand on the steering wheel. Then I touched the dog tags. They were warm from the sun. Behind me, Deputy Harlan cleared his throat and said, "Looks like she made it back." "Yes," I said, "she did." Marlene resigned before the emergency HOA meeting that Friday. The district attorney charged her with vehicle theft, trespass, fraud, and misuse of association authority. Her husband's development company withdrew from the Briar Ridge project within a week. The HOA's insurance carrier forced outside management onto the board, and every fine issued under Marlene's illegal vehicle rule had to be refunded. Mrs. Alvarez got her late husband's tool shed cleared of violations. Thomas Bell's old greenhouse easement was reopened. Wallace Pike brought the founding binder to the next meeting himself and placed it on the table like a Bible nobody had bothered to read. As for me, I replaced the lock on the cedar gate with a stronger one. Then I washed the Jeep by hand, cleaned the dust out of the vents, and tucked my father's letter into a waterproof sleeve behind the visor beside my mother's little silver cross. On Veterans Day, I drove the same route, past the church, past the ball field, past the clinic where he used to pretend he was not scared. The old cassette still worked after one hard click. My father's country music crackled through the speakers, thin and imperfect and exactly right. At the stop sign near the entrance, I looked at the empty place where the sheriff had stopped Marlene 6 minutes after she thought she had won. I did not smile because she lost. I smiled because the Jeep was still carrying him. Some people will always look at old things and see clutter, rust, or inconvenience, but some of us know better. We know a worn seat can hold a voice, a dented bumper can hold a winter night, a pair of dog tags can hold a promise. Marlene thought she was taking an ugly old vehicle. What she really touched was the last moving piece of my father's life. And if something ordinary can carry that much love, then maybe the real question is not what it is worth. Maybe the question is, who has the right to call it worthless?
What happened here says something uncomfortable about how small power works. Because this was never really just about an old Jeep. On the surface, It looked like a vehicle dispute, a storage rule, a violation notice, a board president deciding what did or did not belong behind a private gate. But underneath all of that was a much older question. What happens when someone is given a little authority and starts confusing that authority with ownership? Communities do need rules. Most people understand that. Nobody wants to live in a neighborhood where every standard disappears, where every shared agreement becomes optional, where one person's neglect becomes everyone else's problem. Good rules can protect a community. They can keep peace between neighbors who see things differently. They can give people a fair way to solve problems before they become personal. But rules change character when they are used selectively. The moment a rule becomes a tool for pressure, the moment it is aimed at the quiet person, the older resident, the grieving neighbor, or the homeowner least likely to push back, it stops being about standards. It becomes control dressed up in official language. That is the part people recognize. Maybe not from an HOA, maybe from a workplace, a church committee, a family business, a small town office. Some place where one person had just enough power to make other people tired, nervous, or quiet. And because nobody wanted to be the next target, the behavior kept going. That silence is often misunderstood. People stay quiet for many reasons. They want peace. They do not want gossip. They do not want letters, meetings, lawyers, or attention. They tell themselves it is easier to let this one thing go. But the person abusing authority often reads that silence as permission. That was the mistake here. Marlene did not fail because she enforced rules. She failed because she believed her position placed her above the need to prove anything. She assumed a board title, a printed notice, and a confident voice were enough. She assumed nobody would check the covenants, the vote count, the records, the emails, the history, or the paper trail. Most of all, she mistook calm for weakness. Caleb did not win by being louder than her. He won by refusing to become the version of himself she needed him to be. He did not hand her a scene. He handed the system a record. Dates, letters, video, receipts, documents, proof. That kind of patience is not passive. It takes discipline to stand still when someone is trying to provoke you. It takes restraint to let a pattern reveal itself instead of chasing every insult. And it takes a certain kind of strength to protect something deeply personal without turning the whole thing into rage. Because in the end, the strongest person in the room is not always the one holding the title. Sometimes it is the one who can prove exactly what happened. So maybe the question this story leaves us with is simple. When rules are being used unfairly, what is the right moment to stop being quiet?